Welcome to spiritualitystepbystep.com. My name is Dan Wigner. One of the things that I talk a lot about on this website and on my YouTube channel is mystical or spiritual experiences, along with mystical or spiritual practices. And I thought it might be helpful today to actually take a recorded mystical experience, one in which the experiencer has written down very precisely and fully and thoroughly his experience, and then to try and see the criteria of a mystical experience within that. Okay, so what we're going to do today is use 4 different criteria that come from the philosopher and psychologist William James's varieties of religious experience. And we're going to apply them to a mystical experience recorded by the 20th century mystic Teilhard de Chardin in his book Hymn of the Universe. This mystical experience is in many ways very typical of a mystical experience in that if we were to observe it from a second party vantage point, we might not even notice that anything is happening. It's describing an experience that occurred to him as he was gazing at a picture of Jesus Christ. And in many ways, it is very paradigmatic of what a mystical experience would be. And in his description of it, he spends quite a bit of time talking about the content of the experience and his interpretation of it. So the criteria or characteristics of the experience itself can sometimes be a little overshadowed by the content. Now, of course, to him and to many, the content is the most important part, and I don't want to minimize that. But if we look at the context of the mystical experience and the characteristics of that experience, we can start to see how mystical experiences happen from person to person, religion to religion, and even non-religious versions of a mystical experience. So first, if you look over here to the notes I have, and I have the entirety of the experience, which is a fairly long write-up on both my YouTube channel under this video and on my website. So you can find the entirety of it, and I would recommend to read through that at some point, maybe before you watch this video, maybe after. I'm not going to read the whole thing here. But I do want to mention what those criteria for a mystical experience are. William James labeled them, 4 of them, as ineffability, noetic quality, transiency, and passivity. Wonderful, huge words that take a lot of defining. But to bring those down into more normal terms for us today, when we're talking about ineffability, we're talking about how mystical experiences are difficult to describe. They're just not something that's easy to communicate in everyday language. And what I want to focus on for the first criterion and how I like to translate those criteria is to talk about analogy. You'll find in accounts of mystical experiences, or if you tell your mystical experiences to another person, that you're using a lot of analogy. You're trying to take the indescribable experience and use a describable experience to connect. So look for analogy. That's the first criterion. And usually somewhere in the account of someone saying, oh, this is so difficult to describe. The second criterion, which James refers to as noetic quality, also could just be said knowledge, but he uses noetic quality for a specific purpose because it's not knowledge in the general sense. It's communication of knowledge somehow, not through words, not through reading, not through hearing. And he focused a little bit on how that knowledge just seems to appear. What I like to focus on is not so much that the knowledge just appears, but that look at it as not so much like new knowledge, but it's a change of perspective. Many mystics talk about like, well, I knew that God loved the world before, but now I really know. And that's what they're referring to, is this change in perspective. So that's the second criterion. We have look for it to be indescribable in the use of analogy. Second, a change in perspective, or maybe new knowledge. They might talk in terms of knowledge as well. The third criterion, James labels as transiency. That is talking about how mystical experiences are brief. Often, the time to describe does not represent how long it happened. And you'll find that the experience we're going to look at takes several pages of description in Chardin's book. But according to what he says about it, it happened in a few moments. So it's very, mystical experiences are transient, or what I prefer is to call them is fleeting, which is, I think, a little bit more contemporary of a word. So we've got analogy, change of perspective, and fleeting as characteristics of a mystical experience. The fourth criterion, which William James talks about, is passivity. And by that, he's talking about being passive in the sense that mystical experiences happen to a person. You don't go out and do a mystical experience. They happen to you, and they're unpredictable. So that's what I like to also look for in accounts of a mystical experience, is they're happening to a person, and they're unpredictable. They don't know when they happen. Often they mention them. You know, I had no idea this was going to happen to me today. Or I don't know why that, for instance, with Chardin, looking at that picture, he may have looked at it 1,000 times before and did not have that kind of experience. And that day, for some reason, it happened. Now, if you're interested in an active analog to a mystic experience, you're thinking of a mystic practice or a spiritual discipline. Some type of prayer, some type of meditation that you can actively engage in. But mystical experience, when the divine or God or ultimate reality impacts a person, that's unpredictable. You don't know when it will happen. So let's take a look at his account and see those four criteria in there. They're not necessarily in order, but I want to point out each piece as we go. And again, you can, at your leisure, read the entire experience on my website or my YouTube channel. Okay, first off, he is talking about, viewing this picture of Jesus and having a mystical experience surrounding it. And you can see he starts off by saying, "Meanwhile, my gaze had come to rest without conscious intention on a picture representing Christ offering his heart to men." That without conscious intention is telling us about that fourth quality. It's unpredictable. He didn't plan to do this in advance. It just happened. As we go down his account, we see in the second paragraph, he says, "To tell the truth, I cannot say at what precise moment it began, for it had already reached a certain degree of intensity when I became conscious of it." Again, this same fourth quality of it's happening to him unpredictably. It started before he even knew it was starting. Now, a little bit after, he starts talking about the figures' outlines melting away. They were dissolving, but in a special manner, hard to describe in words. And he's giving us that first criterion that we talked about, that it's difficult to describe. He actually says, hard to describe. And he's going to look for analogies. Since his is based on what he saw, he's going to talk a lot about what he's seeing, but still kind of groping for words. And if you have any familiarity with this writer, Chardin, he is never at a loss for words. He has beautiful poetic words. He has specific and precise scientific words. For him to say something is hard to describe is usually something that would be an understatement for most of us. As we skip down a few more paragraphs, you'll see again he says, "Through this there passed from time to time what seemed like trails of phosphorescence, indicating a continuous gushing forth to the outermost spheres of the realm of matter, and delineating a sort of bloodstream or nervous system running through the totality of life." Here, if you're like, whoa, I don't quite understand that, he's trying to use analogy to describe something that's indescribable. And being a scientist himself, he's trying to think of scientific words that can, like phosphorescence or realms of matter or bloodstream or nervous system, that would in some way communicate what was happening to him, what he saw. Then he says the entire universe was vibrant, and yet when I directed my gaze to particular objects one by one, I found them still as clearly defined as ever in their undiminished individuality. in that short paragraph, he's telling us that second criterion of there's a noetic quality, new knowledge, a change in perspective. The universe and all these individual objects that he could see, they weren't changed. They just, there was something about them that was different, some kind of new knowledge, new perspective that he had about all that was around him. So it's that change in perspective or noetic quality that we can see in his mystical experience. Now he goes on for several paragraphs, and if you notice, I haven't bolded them because he's talking a lot about the content of the experience. Very important, but we're looking at the context of the experience right now. So that's why I don't talk about those in this video. And we skip on down, and he said, I stood dumbfounded. For this final expression, which had dominated and gathered up into itself all the others, was indecipherable. I simply could not tell whether it denoted an indescribable agony or a superabundance of triumphant joy. Again, he's going back to, I can't describe it. He's gone on for page after page of trying to describe it, and he just has to come back and say, I can't describe what actually happened. So that indescribability or ineffability, very characteristic of a mystical experience. And then he ends, and we can almost miss it, it says, in an instant, my eyes were bedimmed with tears, and then when I was once again able to look at it, the painting of Christ on the church wall had assumed once again its too precise definition and its fixity of feature. And in that, he indicates that last part of the fleetingness, that third criterion, the fleetingness of a mystical experience. It happened in an instant. He's gone on for page after page, and we could be forgiven for thinking, well, you stood there for hours. Now, while some mystical experiences do last a significant period of actual time, it's much, much more common for them to occur like this, where it's like an instant, and then, you know, after a few moments, few seconds, maybe a few minutes, you're back to normal. And then the long part of the work is then going through interpretation and reflection to see what that mystical experience meant. And a lot of what we're getting in Chardin's account is his reflection on that experience and what it meant over time, which is typically what we find in an account of a mystical experience and should expect. That is, in some ways, you might even say that is also like the fifth criterion, is the need for reflection after a mystical experience before understanding its meaning. So in kind of brief words, and I would encourage you to go back, if you haven't already, to read his account. That's an anatomy of a mystical experience, the context, what the contours or characteristics or traits of a mystical experience look like when we place them into an actual account of a mystical experience and how we can look for them. So that's what's similar between all the mystical experiences. Maybe on one of my next videos, I'll talk about the content of mystical experiences and how that can vary widely and very interestingly from person to person, culture to culture, and religion to religion. For this and other information, please visit my website, spiritualitystepbystep.com. Also, if you want to leave in the comments, if you're interested in some question of mystical experience or mystic practice, please put that down, and I will record a video or post something to my website, if not in answer to it, at least digging further into the question and discussion of that issue.